dear Monzima, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, it's such a pleasure to be participating in this Bay of Bengal conversation and share a few thoughts on from crisis to opportunity, redefining climate agenda in a changing world. I thank for this opportunity, and I will, as given the task by our dear moderator, I'll talk about two major points. First, about climate agenda in the context of Nepal and what we are doing in terms of enhancing Nepal-Bangladesh relationship. As we all know, climate change is an existential threat to the humanity, both the people and the planet. Our planet is burning, glaciers are melting, sea level is rising, and the humanity is waging the war against nature. All of us know, due to this crisis, climate crisis, the countries in South Asia, the countries like us are at the sharp end of climate change. The toughest impacts of climate change have been on the lives and livelihoods of our people. If I may refer to what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said a couple of days before, on the 12th of November to be precise, at the World Leaders Climate Action Summit, he was talking about climate crisis as being the story of avoidable injustice. It's a problem caused by the rich, but the poor pay the highest price. In fact, the richest billionaires in the world emit more carbon in an hour and a half than the average person does in his or her lifetime. The richest billionaires, when you talk about this type of discrepancy, we can very well understand the disproportionate impact the countries like us, the people, the poorer people like those living in our region bear, and the responsibility that lies with the rich countries and people. The solution is clear and straightforward: more commitment and more action, and of course, in line with the principle which is so well known, the CBDR principle: common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. Now let me turn to what Nepal has been doing in terms of advancing climate agenda, also in the context of the development needs of our people. For the sake of clarity, I'll just highlight three major points. As a party to the Paris Agreement and various other international commitments on climate change, Nepal has enacted all legislative, institutional, and policy frameworks, and they have been put in place. For example, we have our climate change policy 2019. We've submitted our second nationally determined contributions and submitted our third national communication to UNFCCC. Nepal has adopted National Adaptation Action Plan, which outlines 64 major priority programs across 9 thematic areas, which are the crucial areas from our development perspective. These areas include, of course, agriculture and food security, tourism, hydropower and energy, of course, industry, transport sector, and among others. The NAPA, the National Plan of Action, Adaptation Plan of Action, includes adaptation actions to be undertaken in the short term by 2025, in the medium term by 2030, and in the long term by 2050. The overall and the overarching notion of this plan of action has been to adopt a community-led and the involvement of local communities, indigenous people, women, and youth has been the focus of all these programs across all thematic areas. Our top priorities have been conserving and sustainably managing land, forest, mountain, water resources, and promoting a green and resilient economy. Second, because Nepal's economy is mostly dependent on the sectors such as agriculture, tourism, energy, and hydropower, and these are the areas which are hard hit by the crisis like climate change. In 2020, we set a target to maintain 45% of the total land of Nepal to be covered by the forest. And I'm so very pleased to let you know that we have already achieved that target. Our forest cover at the moment stands over 45%. You all know Nepal is considered to be an exemplar in the international community in terms of community forest. By community forest, We have the forest management in which the communities have the ownership and in terms of management and utilization of the forest resources. Clean energy and hydropower, when we talk about this in energy transition, energy solutions to mitigate and adapt to the needs that have emerged due to climate crisis, is one area where Nepal is actually leading. We have a target of generating about 15,000 megawatt of hydroelectricity by 2030, and with the projects which are in the pipeline, the projects that are of which the construction has started, we are well on track to achieve that target. Currently, about 98% of our people have access to electricity, which is almost 100% of which is clean, green, and renewable. We have a commitment to ensure by 2030 that at least 15% of whole energy demand of the country is made from clean energy sources, and so that the country can achieve by 2045 that we are able to decarbonize our economy. Our efforts also to increase the number of electric vehicles is gaining momentum. We have been installing the charging stations all across the country. The 50 charging stations were installed very recently, and the number continues to grow. Third and the last point I would want to make is about the efforts that the government of Nepal is doing, is undertaking to internationalize climate agenda with a particular focus on clean energy and of course mountain agenda, because mountains are very close to our heart and our people. So you might recall Nepal played an instrumental role in incorporating the climate agenda in the SDG negotiations in 2015. If you look at the SDGs 6, particularly SDG 6 and SDGs 15.4, which talks about climate, which talks about mountain agenda and the conservation and preservation of mountain ecosystem, that was one of the initiatives taken by the delegations, including Nepal, of course. And I'm pleased to inform you that the government of Nepal has taken this climate agenda very seriously, and we continue to host high-level talk programs, high-level dialogues, high-level engagements, including at the COP sessions. And the government of Nepal will organize Sagarmatha Samvad. Sagarmatha is a name for Mount Everest, a Nepali name for Mount Everest, around the theme of climate change, mountain agenda, and overall environmental issues. In the next part, I'll just briefly talk about what we are doing in terms of taking this climate agenda and in terms of engaging Nepal's leadership and Nepal's government engagements with Bangladesh. I am so very much pleased to tell you that it was only yesterday that Nepal sent 40 megawatt of electricity, hydroelectricity, to Bangladesh. This is the first of its kind in the sub-region. The volume might be quite small, but this is the first of its kind in the sub-region. The first ever trilateral transaction involving Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. This is just a beginning. Our MOU on power cooperation was signed in 2018. It took almost 6 years. But this is, as I always call it, a springboard, a historic milestone, a springboard which will, of course, set the tone, set the course for our future cooperation. So energy is hydropower, with focus on hydropower is one sector in which our two governments are engaged. And there are also different other projects. For example, Sunkosi 3rd, which is 683 megawatt hydroelectricity power project, in which Nepal and Bangladesh are looking at the JV, a joint venture agreement. And also there is the plan to import electricity from Upper Karnali, which is about 900 megawatt hydropower project. So there are different avenues, different areas in which we are engaging with a focus on hydropower. Secondly, this is very close to our Bangladeshi friends and so to the Nepali people. You must have heard of 30 clubs, which is actually based on the vision of Honorable Dr. Muhammad Yunus. In his book, published in 2017, he talks about 30, the vision of 30. 0, unemployment, zero carbon emission, and zero poverty. This zero carbon emission, and around these 3 zeros, various clubs at the grassroots level, among youths, indigenous communities, women, and all these innovators, very much involving the local people. These clubs have been constituted in various countries, and Nepal is one of the pioneer countries. Nepal is a country in which the highest number of 3-0 clubs are constituted, and they are functional. So they work also to promote the agenda of net zero carbon emission. And there's one more area. Honorable advisor who spoke just before this panel also talked about the impact of floods, landslides, and various natural disasters in the agriculture sector, and of course in the lives and livelihoods of people. And you might recall during the monsoon and post-monsoon period this year, both Nepal and Bangladesh suffered a lot. A lot of people died and their lives and livelihoods were impacted. Just a month back, Nepal lost about 240 people due to this post-monsoon. When monsoon was trying to retreat, we had this disaster hitting our people. So because of this landslide, floods, and various unanticipated rainfall and this pattern, the sharing of information between our countries has been crucial. I'll talk about this maybe in the second part, but because the rivers emanate from Himalayas and come down to Bay of Bengal, these rivers sometimes, due to the unanticipated rain and this unpredictable rain pattern, our people suffer. So we have been sharing information, real-time hydrometeorological data and information for flood forecasting and warning. So this agreement has been in place, and that's one area in which our two countries are cooperating. Finally, I'm sorry for taking a little bit of more time. Finally, there's one area which is less talked about. That's the cooperation between Nepal and Bangladesh in the international forum. And when COP29 is taking place in Baku, Azerbaijan, this is one area that we should focus on because we prioritize LDC issues. Though both of us are going to graduate by 2026 from the LDC least developed country category, but this is an area where climate agenda is our top priority. And we particularly focus on the issue of climate justice with also the focus on loss and damage and climate finance. You might know our priorities have been the the call for the fulfillment of climate finance commitment, replenishment of green climate fund, and operationalization of loss and damage with the call for simple and easy access procedures for the least developed countries like us. The amount that the least developed countries like Nepal and Bangladesh would need by 2030, as it was highlighted very well by the LDC chair a couple of days before in Baku, the need is around $1 trillion US dollar by 2030. It's huge need for the LDCs, and that's where we are struggling. Nepal alone would need, a study suggests that we would need about 33 billion US dollar by 2030 to address the severe impacts of climate change. So these are the areas where we are working together, and these are the areas where we engage with regard to climate change, with regard to addressing climate crisis. And this is very much a top priority of both of our governments, Nepal and Bangladesh, in our bilateral frameworks, in our bilateral mechanisms. We take it as one of the priority as an item, and we hope this will continue to grow and continue to make progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for setting the stage for the conversation and really touching on all of the key aspects that we need to cover through this conversation, from regional collaboration to just energy transition to climate justice conversation. Now I want to move to a different stakeholder in Nepal, really hearing from the civil society voice. Mr. Narayan, we are talking about the transition from crisis to opportunity, and Nepal has faced many crises, from environmental challenges to social pressures. And Accountability Lab Nepal has shown how these crisis moments can drive governance reforms and community engagement. Could you share how your organization has been helping with this with our audience?
Thank you, Monzima. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Namaste. I think our ambassador said a very beautiful tone on how we are building our cooperations between two countries, but at the same time inspiring the whole regions. We all know that every crisis brings opportunity, and the examples from yesterday when Nepal started, supplying the green, clean hydro energy to Bangladesh, I think is the hope. I really like to congratulate for that, and also your leadership being an ambassador. I think he also mentioned a lot of things that I wanted to also touch upon. However, with the interest of the time, I would like to highlight a few things that we do as part of the civil society and non-state actors movements. So Accountability Lab, we focus on making governance work for people by supporting active citizens, responsible leaders, and accountable institutions. What does that mean? Looks like in terms of moving from crisis to opportunity in relations to disaster around economy, environment, social injustice, and digitalizations. So how do we work is we work with young people particularly. We focus on individuals that are pro-change, there are change makers, they have some ideas to kick off in their communities in a way that they want to see the change that they would like to see by innovating ideas, to navigate their life, but at the same time, supporting that community voice and aspirations, and to building that, the power narratives by giving access to tools, platforms, opportunity, and the voice. So it's really about you putting individuals and giving more emphasis on how that individual thinks in terms of investing for their own futures and making today's generation future ready to tackle the crisis. And the second focus that we consider around community building, which I think is very, very crucial, as Ambassador also highlight how communities in different, in different countries in our regions, and including Nepal, for example, the community forestry. So how people, especially the women's and the marginalized communities, are actually acting upon on their own resilience. Right? It's very, very important. So we create a feedback loops where we support communities and local leaders to be proactive and effective on creating that evidence so that they can amplify their voices, but at the same time build that relationship with the stakeholders, particularly with the governments. And we know that we have a lot of grievances. We're not happy the way that the government is working. There are disparities, there are issues about injustice, inequalities, but I think there is no way other than finding a way to collaborate in an effective way. So we give emphasis on how we best create evidence and opportunities so that the parties come together and think through the solutions. And finally, whatever we practice on the ground, we connect connect locally, but at the same time globally. And regionally is also very important for us as we work in Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. So the idea is we want to amplify the impacts that we are creating on the ground, so that the thing that we are doing in one context, one countries, one communities might inspire or might instigate a further movement in other communities. So the last thing is that how we interconnect all this aspiration is through the investment on innovation promotions, right? There are people who wants to make a difference, right? There are talents in our communities, from young people to every generation, but opportunity is not. So we create an opportunity for them to innovate their ideas. So, and we find a ways to support them. It could be around creating technological platforms to sort of create an open data for communities to be able to make them power to negotiate with their government, or simply a community hubs where people come and share their learnings and collaborate. Or it could be about finding a regional youth to youth sort of exchange of voice and ideas, supporting each other's efforts, and contribute towards so towards a positive movement, so that, you know, the generation that we have now, we have hopes, but at the same time we have a lot of frustration and lack of trust and tolerance on what's going on around our, you know, political economy. So I think we are providing that space so that people can come and discuss about challenges, but at the same time look for solutions. I love what the Professor Yunus said about 3-0, you know, targets, but I think there's another one we all know. We all know that we call it zero tolerance and corruption. But I think we're not able to achieve this. We're not really contributing enough on getting that zero tolerance and corruption. But I think we really need to find a way to promote the idea of integrity and accountability, sort of personal accountability, and to build that positive narratives and promote what is working within and inside the governments, and using that power of positivity coming from inside the government, but at the same time outside the government, particularly from the community, in shifting that power and into really balancing that conversation. So let's be honest on what we usually say about zero tolerance and corruptions. But I think we need to focus more on opening government and, you know, creating that access to information, giving more power to the communities, and listening to the communities. I think in these intersections, Accountability Lab, you know, does involve with individuals, communities, and invest in innovation. So I stop here, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights. I want to pick on two aspects that you have brought up, the role of data and information in climate resilience, as well as the role of inclusivity when we're talking about community, and go to my next two speakers. First, I'll go to Ms. Pyrou. You have worked with open data, and we're talking about the importance of data when we're thinking about building climate leadership, right? Data can create opportunities. Data also has challenges. So can you share your experiences with open data? Really, for our audience, explain the terms. What does open data means? Indigenous data sovereignty means, and how that can help us create a sort of cohesive model for climate leadership in the region.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I don't know the knowledge of the audience in terms of their engagement with open data. So it's good to start with the premise that open data has been a movement over the last 2 decades to actually increase transparency around data and information that can be used in decision making. And decision making for lots of different purposes. And the main crux of how open data was supposed to transform government accountability and transparency was that it was very structured data. It was data that was gathered and structured in ways that could be shared, digitized, and openly made accessible to the general public or stakeholders. Now, the majority of this data and this open data was always limited in terms of the scope of that data. It was very difficult and challenging to gather large quantities of data and process it. Bring it forward to nowadays, and we still have problems with structured data. We still have problems with getting accurate data, timely data. All of these barriers are still existing, but we do have the advent of much more powerful computing systems, and it has opened up doors into digital technologies that are advancing into artificial intelligence and other climate models. So this is the premise of open data. The work that we're doing now is to look at this scenario and this framework and say, well, who is excluded from this data? Who is excluded from these data models? And when we talk about climate data, the people that are excluded are the majority of the people. The majority of the people that live and work on the land, the majority of people who are actually protecting our forest and our resources. And so Indigenous data sovereignty is an approach that we've embodied across Asia, where we've tried to articulate what does it mean for an Indigenous person to translate their data and their knowledge into an environmental eco data system that is reflective of not only that knowledge and their approaches and views on how environmental systems are governed, but also how they can actually take control of that data and information to assert governance over natural resources in ways that would articulate greater rights that respects their cultural traditions and practices, but also bring forward an approach that could intersect with global approaches that could then shift some of these existing mainstream narratives to taking more innovative and inclusive ways on how to actually govern and manage climate actions. So we have worked with Indigenous communities across South Asia and Southeast Asia to articulate this framework, and it was very challenging because Asia is very eclectic, and when you talk about data and data systems, and environmental systems, the language doesn't translate. And so it's very difficult to even translate the word data into ethnic languages. So ultimately, the framework is called the Indigenous Knowledge Data Framework, and it articulates the ways in which environmental data that is housed within knowledge systems of environmental peoples should be collected, stored, used, and repurposed, and then how it should also be deprecated if needed, and also uphold the rights and responsibilities of Indigenous peoples. And I think fundamentally, when we talk about technology and information systems or climate action, we often separate these areas of studies into different funnels. So the technologists will talk about technology and environmental data, and the Indigenous peoples talk about lands and Indigenous and environmental rights, and then we have the governments and policies. And what we're not seeing within these systems is this overlap and crossover. So Indigenous knowledge has a fundamental purpose and a growing value in the way we're articulating and addressing climate change globally, and this is being recognized. Yet, we're still segmenting their role away from their actual rights to lands and territories, and I think this is the crux of the difference between just talking about environmental data and Indigenous data, in that Indigenous peoples have a true sense of connection to their lands and territories, and there's an vested rights there that they should be able to contribute to the governance over those lands and territories. And by including them in data ecosystems in ways that respects that rights, we also then all gain from that knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for bringing up that Asia is very eclectic, but even then we can't leave anyone behind. And one of the biggest concern has been the siloing of different issues, right? So that takes me to my next panelist, Mr. Arjan. If you could share with the audience how Claire has been working to integrate social equity with climate resilience, and if you could share how this integration works in practice, what has been the major challenges when we're talking about we can leave no one behind, but how does that work in practice, and what we can learn in terms of the leadership and opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much, Monzima, and thank you to the organizer, to Silor, for this opportunity. It's been a fantastic morning, and I just want to hear more from my co-panelists, including the leadership that we hear from Nepal. It's such an honor to speak at this panel, and I feel particularly happy that this is taking place in Bangladesh. And I feel there's a very useful competition almost going on between Nepal and Bangladesh and leadership in adapting to the impacts of climate change. And here in Bangladesh, of course, it's wonderful to speak about that, including because of the legacy of the late Salimur Haque, of course, who has inspired so many of us to work on those critical issues. And then, yeah, it's a privilege to be sharing some of the thoughts of a large research program that I work on. I work for the International Development Research Centre and with the UK's FCDO, we fund global research on, it's called CLARE, Climate Adaptation and Resilience. And within that, we focus indeed on the objectives of, on integrating climate resilience and social equity concerns. And the two main things that it's almost a premise, and we also conclude that like you cannot afford to do one without the other. And the second thing, and that's where the research is coming in, looking at both can also provide enormous benefits. We can make those actions more effective, and in a time where economic resources are scarce, I think this is incredibly important. And we need, and that's what we work on, good evidence on how to do this. So put differently, how can countries invest in climate objectives? And I think this applies to all the countries we're talking about here. How can countries invest in climate objectives in the SDGs, or the SDGs also sit in, but both are very important. And in the context of economic stress, high levels of that, the economic cost of climate change. So integrating those objectives is not easy, but as I said, while they're challenging, the payoffs can also be large. First of all, to say, whatever Trump is going to do, I wanted to say, I mean, it's a horrible thing to say, the impacts of climate change are there. We are locked into 1.5, 2 degrees heating. There is unfortunately no doubt about it. And those averages don't tell the full story. As I heard recently in Nepal, for example, you can confirm that 1.5 is already way too much for mountainous regions. 1.5 is already way too much for Bangladesh. The impacts of what we already see and what we will see over the next 20 years are there, and we need to prepare for that. And of course, Bangladesh has clearly seen this over the last year, over this political transition. There were at least 3 major floods. There was an unprecedented heat wave, and the country is dealing with this at a pace that I think we have not seen before. Now, what the research shows and what we're working on, and I think you referred to that as well, is that when communities are put in leading the responses to those floods and to those heat, and often youth and women are at the forefront of this, the responses tend to be more cost effective. The example that I want to give you, I'd love to spend more time talking about you, is one of the projects we have here with the grassroots organization Uttaran, was supported by North-South University and Action Against Hunger in 2 areas in Bangladesh. It works very closely with local communities and policymakers to develop better forecasts of water surges, which of course in this region is a major issues. And these evidence-based forecasts and use the best technologies available for that can improve existing early action protocols to reduce the impacts of these surges on coastal people, surges that will continue to happen and are intensifying. And it can reduce the impact, again, particularly on the most vulnerable groups, including on women and marginalized communities. So this project expects to benefit 500,000 people, and I'll come back to that later, because 500,000 is great, but not enough, but also a methodology that can be expanded to the rest of the country. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that the impacts of climate change are there. We should not kid ourselves about that have disproportional impacts, but there are also significant opportunities in putting those impacted communities at the forefront of the responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to go to Dr. D'Souza, and we have been hearing about a lot of these opportunities, right? But then geopolitics come into play and it complicates collaboration. So if you could tie this conversation together regarding what has been so far the major challenges in balancing security, economy, and the needs of climate resilience, and bring in the geopolitics angle to it and help my audience understand why we're not seeing as much progress as there should have been. And there is already so much realization out there and so many pilot projects going on, so many opportunities have been created. So over to you.
Thank you. I think it very well blends with the earlier session on geopolitics and the relevance of talking on something very important, that is on climate. When you look at climate, it's the elephant in the room. So I really want to compliment and congratulate the organizers for having a session on climate leadership, which is really lacking not just in the region, but also on the global level. So when we look at climate change and we look at the debate in terms of securitizing the climate action agenda, I think there's a huge area of concern of how countries have used climate as a weapon of dividing. For instance, if you look at the division between the global north and the global south, countries in the region between India and China at various ways, and how these tensions play out at various levels. So I think to understand the granular details of how countries can evolve policies, one at the national level, which has been talked about in a bit in terms of improving governance and capacities, it's also about the historical legacy or the responsibility of the developed countries to help the developing world. And that debate has really not been addressed at various levels. As we speak, the COP summit is occurring in Baku, and again we see the same issue being periodically highlighted in terms of climate finance, just energy transition, building the capacities of the developing world, giving the required amount or resources for the developing world to address this issue. But that has really not been addressed in COP summits. So what are we looking at when we talk about climate issues and conversations in Bay of Bengal or in the South Asia region, which again goes with the theme of the conversation of a very fractured world. We're also in a very fractured region. Despite having huge cultural and civilizational connect, we do have issues of differences playing out at various levels. And what is it that really would unite or bring these countries on a unified platform? It is climate. And interestingly and surprisingly, countries in the regions have not taken up the role of bringing that agenda on the global scale, of having a unified South Asian approach. You do have a lot of regional cooperation frameworks and organizations. For instance, there is SAARC, which is almost non-functional in many ways. But one of the areas which SAARC had focused on was on climate and response to natural disasters. And herein again, I think I would like to emphasize that regional organizations could take up that role, and SAARC would be a useful platform for that, to start as an area of cooperation, tying the countries together in a mutually beneficial framework so the competition is reduced and the cooperation is increased. And why do I say that? I mean, the impacts have already been talked about. I don't want to get into the details. But who's going to be hit most and who's going to be affected the most? And it is Asia. If you look at the map of the climate change and the impact it's having, for instance, India has huge concerns, particularly when you look at Northeast India and you look at areas around Sundarbans in West Bengal. Likewise with Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, which again is forgotten by the world with what's happening in that country. Afghanistan is facing huge climate disorders. So we don't have an understanding of what's happening in South Asia here. And then we talk on a global level, and the disconnect plays out at various levels, and the tensions are really not addressed. So I think we need to have a more integrated approach of understanding. One is what happens in the national level. How are the NDCs determined? And what is the data which really gets into the NDCs for the countries to come up with that kind of levels or that kind of understanding that they will achieve the net zero emissions by, say, like for instance, India says 2070, China says 2060, that if a country projects that they will achieve that emissions and they are working towards that, how is the developed world helping them? Just not on finances, but also on technology to achieve that. So we have to look at these issues in a more integrated approach, trying to understand the grassroots details of those who have been marginalized, those who have been impacted by the climate stress and disasters which are occurring, and bringing about opportunities for people in the margins. So let's start with a very bottom-up approach of bringing in community-led resilience, community-led initiatives which are existing in this part of the world but haven't got that attention. So I think we need a kind of a data hub, just not on the data available of what's really impacting, but of what communities are doing. How do we link them up, say from villages to districts, districts to the centers, and then to the region, and then to the global order, So I think a more of an understanding and working on those issues will minimize the geopolitical tensions in many ways when countries come together on a cooperative framework, and that is built through the people, not by the governments of the day. Governments could change, governments could have different policies, but if it's a common good like climate and environmental issues, I think there's one area where we can focus more on. And as a group, when we're talking about this in a conversation like this, which is a serious platform, I think serious work has to be started in terms of building that data, building a hub, and building the platforms of collaboration for the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, maybe during our next round of conversation, we can focus a bit more on the other issues. For example, we need to talk about the scalability that has been brought up. We need to talk about the regional collaboration issues. So maybe in the interest of time, we can keep our responses short so that we can leave some time for question and answer, maybe 2 minutes each. I want to go back to Mr. Ambassador and really bring up that point of the role of regional collaboration. When we're talking about SAARC, it hasn't been as effective, but it's only the issue of climate that probably can bring it back to surface. So going back to your earlier point, if you could focus on the issue of regional collaboration, what could be the major opportunities and challenges when we're thinking about regional collaboration? So.
Thank you. When we talk about regional collaboration, regional cooperation in South Asia and broader Bay of Bengal region, we always speak about the organic linkages existing between the Himalayas and the Bay of Bengal. All the talk around the SAARC, BIMSTEC, BBIN and broader regional frameworks in our region have been this natural linkage, the organic linkage which connects the Himalayas, the majestic mountains with the Bay of Bengal. And what connects them are the rivers. These rivers which emanate from the snow-capped mountains, the Himalayas, and then flow all the way down to the Bay of Bengal. They are not only the natural body of waters, not only the geographical demarcation lines between our countries and territories, but also those demarcations which also connect the peoples, their identities and their civilizations. Therefore, we always talk about the strong connection, scientific evidence and strong connection between the people living in the mountainous regions and those living in the coastal areas. That has been the talk. That's why when we talk about climate change or regional cooperation around this theme, we always focus on, deeper integration, deeper regional cooperation, so that the people living in the mountainous regions and the coastal areas are connected not only through what they do, how they try to address the climate change issues, but also how they synchronize their efforts and address these challenges so that they are mutually beneficial. These majestic mountains that I talked about have so much of snow that we call them, the scientists call them the third pole, because the cold is so intrinsic to their identity that the very name Himalaya in Sanskrit means the abode of snow. But unfortunately, these snow-capped mountains and glaciers are losing so much of ice because of global warming and climate change. Actually, according to a report published by ICIMOD in June 2023, about a year ago, that on the current trajectory, these glaciers in the Hindu Kush Himalayas could lose up to 80% of their current volume, and the snow cover might be falling by up to a quarter by the end of this century. This is quite alarming. The Hindu Kush region, which connects 8 different countries, and of course, by extension, 16 different countries in Asia. And it not only caters, this Hindu Kush Himalayan region not only caters to the needs of 240 million people living in the mountainous region, but also about 1.8 billion people living downstream. So it caters to the needs of the lives and livelihoods of these people, not only by providing fresh water, but also by providing various and catering to the needs of various kinds of these people. So when we talk about regional collaboration and talking about this deeper regional integration, around climate change. There have been some efforts in the past. For example, South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation, SAARC, adopted a plan of action on climate change in 2008, as early as 2008. And there are also efforts to synchronize BIMSTEC activities along with the SDGs related to clean energy, climate change, and broader other areas. And plan of action under BIMSTEC framework is under negotiation. At the moment, there are 7 different sectors which we prioritize in BIMSTEC, and 7 different member states lead each of those sectors, and Bhutan leads climate change agenda, and the plan of action being developed under BIMSTEC, I'm sure, will be helpful to integrate our countries to enhance collaboration among us. Energy grid interconnection is one area where we are making some progress, and we have been assisted by development partners under BIMSTEC framework. We also focus on developing ecotourism under BIMSTEC, and there are efforts to build ecotourism circuits. We call them tourism circuits, connecting different tourism sites in member states under the BIMSTEC framework. So the idea of sharing experiences and lesson learned and best practices, as they say, under BIMSTEC framework among BIMSTEC member states is also one area that we are making some progress on. So there's a need. I would want to emphasize that, yes, with regard to regional collaboration and cooperation in climate change, I think there are a lot of areas where we could have made more progress. I completely agree. But there's already some mechanism, there are certain mechanisms, certain frameworks in place which emphasize broader regional solidarity and mobilization of resources, empowerment of youth and local communities to bring them together to address the changes of climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. As Mr. Narayan, I want to go to you and really highlight one of the stakeholders that we haven't still touched on, the role of youth, when we're talking about deeper regional engagements. If you could shed some light on how we can engage more youth in climate leadership when we're thinking about the Indo-Pacific region, because as they say, we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. So we need to get more youth voices in climate leadership, and how can we do that?
Thank you. You mentioned about youth. I should congratulate and acknowledge the courage that the Bengali young people took and proud us as a citizen of the region. I think that's what we need to do. But to sustain the change, I think we also need to invest a lot of our time, efforts, mindset, the value systems, and the approach on how we want to sustain the change is, I think, the few proposition I have. The one is, we all know that the problem that we are facing is so interconnected, it's so intersectional, and it's so organized. Like corrupt peoples are so organized, for example, right? They have a deep-rooted, highly efficient system of connections, and they trust each other so highly. However, the solution is not interconnected, the solutions are not coordinated, and it's very fragmented. And that actually resonates with the theme of this Bay of Bengal conversation, the fragmented world. So I think we need to, if we recognize the problems are interconnected and complex, then we need to find a simple solution, but that is very, very interconnected and intersectional. And that's where I see the role of young people, finding an innovative solution on that. And then another thing that I really see from the perspectives of the power coming from the communities is about, are we ready, and do we have the mechanism and the methods to measure the power, asset, the knowledge of the local communities, the marginalized communities, the ethnic communities, so that we cannot just always keep talking about we need to focus on grassroots, but we will have the mechanism, the institution, the now policies and laws that actually give directions to the government, private sectors, and the civil society to think and how you best measure the real assets of the community, so that you can give a power to the communities more And then, Ambassador mentioned about we have this existing system, SARC, BIMSTEC. This is amazing. However, these are not functioning well. We have to be honest on that. And this is the time to revisit all these institutional mechanisms. If the institutions were built at a certain point of time, it has not really led so progressively. I know there's a lot of political tension, there's instability, there's misunderstanding, there's different priorities of different countries. But I think we need to now rethink on how we best build the rules that resonates the aspirations of the people, that relates with the with the interest of the people. So are we ready to give a space, but again the people who have not voiced it yet, young people, women, ethnic communities, and the private sectors, young entrepreneurs, for example. And then the idea about open data, I really like what Pyrou mentioned about, but however, when we say about creating a technology and access to open data, but we also need to invest a lot in protecting people and the users and not making them more vulnerable while we are creating access to all these new opportunities. And finally, every transformations, let's say we are talking about green transitioning from traditional economy to green economy, but transitions cost a lot, and we should not forget about the justice of the people. Okay, we want hydropower, for example. These are green green energy. However, we need to think, while we are generating these hydropowers, are we giving enough justice to the people living surrounding next to the jungle, next to forest, and next to all these dam sites? I think these are crucial things we all need to think on, and I think young people have more responsibilities. And with all the crisis brings opportunity, and sometimes it all may bring frustration, but again the frustrations will bring more responsibility too. Yeah, I see the young people's role there.
I want to pick on that point about shifting the power and want to bring into the conversation the role of artificial intelligence and go to Ms. Pyrou, if you could.
I know, that's a
really
huge black box.
Very
Literally.
quickly about.
Literally, artificial intelligence is a huge black box, but in the context of the climate discussion, it's actually really pressing because much of the green energy transition, the just energy transition discussions, many of the green tech developments and policies that are being implemented across the region at the moment are really invested in the artificial intelligent technologies. And one thing that we have to understand what artificial intelligence is, which I don't think I have time to go into. But one thing that we must remember is the political narratives around climate action. So the political narratives are dominated by the global dominant nations who aren't necessarily affected by climate actions. And the majority of technology is actually produced in these nations. And that includes China, the US, and Europe. And much of that technology is actually being imposed upon the global majority. The global majority are not in control of that technology. They don't have the intellectual property rights over that. They're usually not engaged in the governing structures of those systems, nor are they actually represented. So the applications of these technologies are vested in interests that sit outside of the majority that is being affected by the climate actions they're being implemented to solve. And I've seen this time and time again with the communities that we work with who are rice farmers or traditional forest gatherers or their indigenous communities where they're being asked to transition their livelihood practices to use technologies that are not applicable to them, and they're not applicable to the circumstance. And then you have to ask the question, where are these dominant narratives coming from, and where is this drive being driven from? And it does lead up to global settings like the UN, again, where recognition for Indigenous knowledge is really prevalent now during COP discussions. However, it's sidelined into a sub-working group, and it's not mainstreamed within the solutions and the climate agenda. And so by segmenting that out, then you don't have a voice that's interjecting and linking the real impacts of some of these climate actions that are implemented through technologies to what's actually happening up at the global level. And so there's a disconnect there, and I think some of the speakers have already highlighted this sort of inequality and the necessity to actually have a bottom-up approach. So how do we flip these power dynamics and flip these narratives to actually benefit communities, for them to not only take control and leadership within designing the technologies themselves, making sure that their voices within these systems are integrated so that the decisions that then are derived, or the decision aids that are derived from these systems, actually get reflected into actionable approaches that benefit them. So I think that's really, really important, and that also takes a whole political shifts and also institutional shifts, as well as changing narratives around the climate agenda overall.
Thank you very much for bringing the point about dominant narratives. And I want to go to Mr. Arjan and ask him, how do you think research organizations can play a role in shifting those, in flipping those narratives? What sort of collaboration might encourage that, given we are talking about breaking those silos, we're talking about flipping those narratives, we're talking about creating an opportunity for voices that are unheard?
Thank you, and I just want to acknowledge the importance of the comments that Pyrou makes there. This is, and that's and which she started off saying, this is a black box. This needs a much longer. And I just want to acknowledge that. And my answer, what I'm going to say, isn't the full answer to that. I do want to go partly perhaps answer that and go back to, so we do, in the international development community and the research that my organization and many others support, we do have examples of where I talked about the integrating of those different, they are there, and I want to say that there are opportunities to learn more about those, and that's partly bringing those communities together. That we know is incredibly powerful. We probably don't do enough of that, but also learn about the challenges. So when I think and what we know about, we have excellent pilots on lift irrigation in Nepal, for example, excellent green technology being implemented. Too often these remain quite frankly remain pilots, and they're not being skilled. And I think it's really important potential to learn regionally in whatever form about why they. Similarly with the implementation of plans, Nepal as Bangladesh, they have excellent national plans, and what we know, the recent adaptation gap report now starts describing, the gap between the plans and the implementation, and there's really important lessons to learn about why there is that gap, because it's really important to fill that, and ask the questions about the capacities that are needed and the learning that can be promoted from that. And the third point I want to make, and we're running out of time, I realize that, is finance. There is not enough climate finance available, not internationally and not nationally. Too little of that, too little money is going to the communities that are most impacted and most needed. And I think where there's a really important thing and a really important opportunity to learn regionally is the ecosystems that we need to close that gap. And that is about governments taking the lead. That is about more international money. We need to continue I'm like talking to myself, right? Like we need to generate more international money. We need to bring in the private sector, and we're not doing that effectively at this point at all. And we need to learn about how kind of public and private sectors can work together, and we need to do all that to leverage that money to the communities that's most needed. That is for me, the most important thing, and to promote that through a regional forum, like BIMSTEC, for example, would be an enormous opportunity. Thank you.
I would finally like to come to Dr. D'Souza, and before we can probably take one or two questions from the audience, but before that, if you could sum up this conversation for me and tell us what do you think is the biggest challenge and opportunity when we're thinking about turning climate crisis into leadership for the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, you've given me a Herculean task of, summing up a very important and very diverse conversation at this moment. But what I would like to say is that I think it's very evident there is a lack of unity in understanding the scale and the necessity of climate action at this point of time. There is a divide, as I mentioned before, between the global north and south and within the region as well. And how do we bridge that is one thing in terms of looking at understanding each country's capacities, their necessity, and also building that platforms for collaboration. So if you look at the opportunity, I think it's there because I think climate agenda is one thing which will bring countries on the table together. Countries which are having very different views on other issues can come together. And that is interestingly linked with public health, with trade, with economic opportunities as well. So when you're looking at just transitions and you're looking at making the region more equitable, I think there is an agenda here of setting it up on a platform, maybe on a regional scale, on a regional organization platform, or a new organization which just looks at climate and looks at issues in a very integrated manner. So there is an opportunity. The challenges exist, but it depends on how you address those challenges. If you're looking at economic challenges, clearly climate is having an economic impact. And I mean, if you look at the studies being done and the conversations which you're having, the narratives which are being spun in various parts of the world, I think we need to have a clear strategic communication policy or advocacy at various various levels of informing citizens at the grassroots level. Many of them don't even know what's climate change when we're talking about sitting in elite rooms like this and how it impacts them. And then at the other level, you have governments who are addressing it, but they're not able to integrate at various levels, be it between the district centers and between various states. And so we need an approach where we have a hub of bringing in that knowledge from the indigenous communities which will help this region more than having foreign technologies. You also need climate finance for addressing major issues in terms of bringing in that technology which is required and addressing the loss and damage which has occurred, because these countries still do need assistance. So it has to be a combination of both, of having the public-private partnership, the indigenous knowledge, and the global assistance which is required to come to some understanding of what is the level we are looking at and how do each countries address them. So we are looking at common but differentiated responsibilities and with respective capacities, and that I think is the key. I would like to stop here. Maybe you can have more questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It has been a rich conversation, and I understand that we are stopping you all from having the much desired lunch. But now that you have the opportunity, if there is any burning question from the audience, maybe we can go for two at best. But we will give you an opportunity to ask questions to the panelists. If you could briefly introduce yourself and direct the questions to a particular panelist, that would be very useful. I'll go with Sir there, and then we will come back to you. Thank you.
Speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen and participants, Assalamu alaikum and a very good evening. I am Lieutenant Colonel Thin, retired from Bangladesh. We have heard a lot of enlightening words, very wise words from the speakers, but today's focus was on the Asia and Indo-Pacific region. Now, since I am a Bangladeshi, I would like to be pointing out the problems we are facing in Bangladesh and how to resolve it. First of all, you all know Bangladesh is a riverine country, and we have 54 rivers sharing with India. And India is our neighbor encircling us. Out of 54 rivers, they have made barges, hydroelectric dams on 53 rivers. And I'm cutting short, which you all know, for which we are having drought during summertime. We are having excess devastating floods during our rainy season. And even in the after the August, for last 3 months, we had 3 devastating floods, which has taken a lot of lives and which has cost us a lot. Now, my question is to the speakers that is there any such international policies or rules that the upstream countries can create or construct such dams unanimously? Or if they cannot construct, how to resolve this matter now? Already they have constructed. You know the adverse effects for which our salinity has grown, our fish species has extinction, our mangrove forest is in extinction. So we want some positive suggestions from you that we can come out of this problem.
Thank you, sir. Can we have both the questions at once and then we can go to the panelists?
Thank you, ma'am, because, sorry, me?
Let's.
Well, thank you for giving me the floor. I'm Ifa Saira, currently studying in University of Dhaka and conducting a research on climate advocacy. So my concern is, as the youth or young generation are the major stakeholder for this climate change. And we're seeing lots of youth advocates are emerging in this field of climate advocacy, and many of us are choosing it as their fellow career. But in spite of this implication of youth climate activists or advocates, we do not see much progress in adopting climate policies or climate actions seriously by our global leaders. So my question is, to make this advocacy effective, what recommendations can you give us, the young people, so we can truly make our global leaders accountable? And how can we try to raise good wills among them? Thank you.
Sorry, we can take only 2 questions. I would like to now turn back to the panelists. Anyone? Do we have a taker?
Can I interject about the dams? I don't have a solution, but I can share some of the experiences that we've taken in the Mekong region. So the Mekong sub-basin, the lower Mekong region, consists of 5 countries, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and some parts of Myanmar. And the Mekong derives from China, and China has dammed the majority of the mainstream, and it's dammed a lot of the downstream regions of the river, plus many of its tributaries. And it's been quite a struggle, not only to unify the 5 Mekong countries in terms of their transboundary agreements in water management, but also between those 5 countries and China. And the progress has, they have established a regional committee on transboundary water management, which rests within the Mekong River Commission, which is a body that helps to try and provide the necessary advice and guidance on what are best practices, not only around designing these hydropower projects, but their impacts upon communities and lower stream communities. The body is not body that is binding or has any legitimacy of power. And so although it's really a lovely thing to have and that the state bodies come together and talk about these significant issues, the political powers that make the decisions around the hydropower projects and investments are vested interests. So regardless of having a committee that has enormous amounts of data and information and evidence on how destructive some of these large hydropower projects can be, they still forge ahead. And some of the successes that we've had in the region has been from grassroots policy lobbying. And this goes back to the question around youth activism. And so some hydropower dams across the Mekong region have been halted because of community-led actions that invested in designing and developing their own investigations into the impacts of these hydropower projects, that brought those voices to light and lobbied and rallied within these political forums, such as at the MSC and other higher level ASEAN forums. And that did help to shift the needle a little bit, and it did help to influence some projects to be halted. Every vested interest in every single one of these projects will have different levels of power, but youth are fundamental to that. And the youth activists that were engaged in the Swalene River hydropower project that got halted was fundamental. It's the last full stretch of river in Myanmar to be undammed, and that was instrumental. And I think that we need to invest more in these youth actions because they have the most to lose, but the most to gain if they're actually heard. And I would also encourage youth leadership to actually proactively engage in politics. So if you want to influence governments, you need to engage in those systems. And so I really do encourage our youth leaders for that.
Thank you very much. That is the perfect ending to this very complex session. I thank the panelists for their extremely insightful observations and comments. Thank you very much for giving us an engaging audience. And I thank the organizers for giving us an opportunity to sit together and discuss all of these very critical issues. Let's end the session here. And
I would request all the speakers and the moderators to come in front of the stage for a photo. Please come in front of the stage for a formal photo.